December 7, 1942. Dawn broke over the Solomon Islands like a blade unsheathed from its scabbard. The sky hung heavy with tropical humidity, the kind that clung to a man's skin and made his flight suit feel like a second layer of flesh. Over the coral ridges of Guadalcanal, where the jungle breathed with 1,000 unseen threats, a single Grumman F-4F Wildcat banked through morning thermals, its engine humming that distinctive Pratt and Whitney growl, a sound that had become as familiar to American pilots as their own heartbeat. The aircraft bore the scars of combat: patched bullet holes along the fuselage, a replaced canopy panel that didn't quite match the original, paint worn thin where mechanics' hands had worked through sleepless nights. This was not a pristine machine fresh from the factory floor in Bethpage, New York. This was a survivor. At the controls sat Captain Joseph Jacob Foss, though on this particular morning, the pilot was not Foss himself but one of the young men he had trained, schooled in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat where hesitation measured the difference between life and a watery grave in the Pacific. The Wildcat climbed through scattered clouds, its stubby wings catching the first golden light of day. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the whitecaps that marked the dangerous waters between islands, Japanese commanders were calculating their next move in a chess game played with human lives and national ambitions. They did not yet know that this single fighter, this outdated barrel of rivets and determination, would soon author a chapter in the war's narrative that would be studied in flight schools for generations to come. The F-4F Wildcat had never been the aircraft that captured imagination in the way that its successor, the F-6F Hellcat, would. It was slower than the legendary Japanese Zero by nearly 60 miles per hour. It climbed like an overloaded freight elevator. Its rate of roll in combat made pilots feel as though they were wrestling a stubborn mule rather than flying a precision instrument of war. But the Wildcat possessed something that numbers on a specification sheet could not capture. It was built with an American philosophy that prized survivability over elegance, endurance over grace. Its airframe could absorb punishment that would have sent lighter aircraft spiraling into the sea in pieces. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, a technology that Japanese designers had deemed too heavy and unnecessary, meant that a burst of enemy fire did not automatically translate into a funeral pyre at 20,000 feet. By December of 1942, the Pacific War had been raging for exactly 1 year. The shock of Pearl Harbor had transformed into something harder, more determined. A grinding campaign of attrition across thousands of miles of ocean, where victory was measured in yards of jungle captured, in cargo ships that reached their destination, in pilots who returned when the odds said they should not. Guadalcanal had become the hinge upon which the entire theater turned. The island itself was not strategically valuable in any traditional sense. It possessed no vital resources, no deep-water harbors that could shelter a fleet. But it had an airfield, and in the Pacific War, airfields were currency more valuable than gold. From Henderson Field, American aircraft could interdict Japanese supply lines, could protect the sea lanes that fed Australia, could slowly strangle the empire's southern advance. The Japanese understood this with perfect clarity, which is why they had thrown wave after wave of men and aircraft at the island, why their naval guns had pounded the runway by night, why their pilots flew missions that stretched their fuel reserves to the breaking point. The young pilot in the Wildcat that morning had been briefed on what to expect. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy air activity. Reconnaissance flights had spotted formations assembling at Rabaul, the massive Japanese base to the north that served as the staging ground for their operations in the Solomons. The pattern had become familiar. Bombers escorted by Zeros would come south, aiming to crater Henderson Field, to destroy parked aircraft, to kill the mechanics and fuel handlers who kept the American air effort alive. American fighters would scramble to intercept, and in the sky above those contested waters, men would try to kill each other with bullets and cannon shells, while their nations spoke of honor and destiny and the inevitable triumph of their respective causes. But something different unfolded on this morning. The radar operators at Henderson Field, working with equipment that was primitive by later standards but revolutionary for its time, picked up the incoming raid while it was still 80 miles out. The warning klaxon sent pilots sprinting across the perforated steel planking toward their aircraft. Engines coughed to life in clouds of blue smoke. Ground crews pulled wheel chocks and slapped aircraft sides in the universal gesture that meant, "You're clear to go." The Wildcat launched into air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and coral dust, joining other fighters that rose to meet the threat like angry wasps defending their nest. The Japanese formation appeared as specks on the horizon, then resolved into the familiar silhouettes that American pilots had learned to identify in split-second glances. Twin-engine Betty bombers in a tight V formation, and above them, spread in a loose combat patrol, the Zeros. 18 enemy aircraft in total, according to the combat reports filed later. 18 against the dozen or so Wildcats that had managed to get airborne. The mathematics were unfavorable but not impossible. American pilots had learned that the Zeros' advantages in speed and maneuverability could be countered by disciplined tactics. Never try to turn with them, use diving attacks that exploited the Wildcats' superior weight and structural strength. Make one pass and extend away before the enemy could bring their lighter aircraft around for a countershot. The engagement began at 23,000 feet, where the air grew thin and cold despite the tropical latitude. The Wildcats dove through the Zero screen, guns hammering, trying to break up the bomber formation before it could reach its target. The sky transformed into a three-dimensional maze of tracer rounds and aircraft maneuvering at the edge of their performance envelopes. Two Zeros latched onto the tail of the lead Wildcat, their 20mm cannons sending bright flashes through the sky. The American pilot did what his training demanded. Pushed his nose down and dove, using gravity and his aircraft's robust airframe to accelerate beyond what the lighter Zeros could safely match. The Japanese fighters followed but could not close the distance before the Wildcat pulled out of the dive at an altitude that made their own recovery uncertain. This was when the pattern began, the pattern that would perplex Japanese pilots and later become the subject of intense tactical analysis. The Wildcat in question, the same scarred fighter that had climbed into the dawn, found itself separated from its squadron mates. This should have been a death sentence. A lone American fighter against multiple Zeros was a scenario that typically ended one way. The Japanese pilots recognized this, and they pressed their attack with the confidence of men who had been taught from their first flight training that their aircraft was superior, that American pilots were soft and undisciplined, that numerical advantage was destiny made manifest. The first attack came from the classic Zero position. Diving from above and behind, the sun at the attacker's back. The Japanese pilot opened fire at 400 yards, his tracers arcing through the space where the Wildcat should have been. But the American pilot had seen the attack developing. A glint of canopy glass, a shadow moving against the cloud deck, and he had rolled his aircraft into a hard barrel roll that brought him out of the line of fire while simultaneously reversing his direction. The Zero flashed past, and in that brief moment of roll reversal, the Wildcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns spoke. The convergence point of those 6 weapons had been carefully set by the aircraft's armorer, adjusted so that all rounds would meet at a specific distance. When a target entered that killing zone, the effect was devastating. The Zero took hits along its wing root and engine cowling. It did not explode in the dramatic fashion of Hollywood films, but it began trailing smoke and it fell away from the fight, its pilot making the hard choice between trying to reach friendly territory and the certainty of crashing into the sea. The Japanese formation adjusted. 2 more Zeros peeled off to deal with this impudent American who had just damaged one of their number. They came in from opposite sides, a scissoring attack meant to force the Wildcat into choosing which threat to face while the other gained a killing position. But the American pilot had learned his trade in the brutal school of actual combat, where textbook maneuvers met the chaos of real physics and human reaction times. He pulled his aircraft into a steep climb, using his engine's power and the Wildcat's ability to absorb punishment to climb into the thinner air where his aircraft's heavier wing loading actually provided an advantage. The 2 Zeros followed, but their attacks were no longer coordinated. One had climbed too steeply and bled off too much airspeed, while the other found himself staring at the Wildcat's tail rather than its vulnerable flank. The second Zero to make a pass came in with textbook precision, closing from a quartering angle that should have given the American pilot no escape route. The Zero's guns lit up at 300 yards. Rounds walked across the sky toward the Wildcat, and this time some found their mark. The American aircraft shuddered as 7.7mm rounds punched through wing metal, as a 20mm cannon shell detonated against the armored seatback that protected the pilot from rear attacks. The Wildcat's rugged construction absorbed the hits. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented a catastrophic fire. The engine continued its steady roar, unperturbed by damage that would have brought down lighter aircraft. The American pilot felt the impacts, felt the controls grow slightly heavier as hydraulic fluid began seeping from severed lines, but his aircraft remained flyable. He stood on his rudder pedals, kicked the Wildcat into a skidding turn that threw off the Zero's tracking solution, and again those 6 machine guns found their voice. This time the effect was immediate and final. The Zero pilot had made the classic mistake of following his target through a maneuver without considering his position relative to the other American aircraft, which had now rejoined the fight. He found himself in a crossfire, taking rounds from 2 different angles. His aircraft's fuel tank, unprotected by the rubber lining that American designers had made standard equipment, erupted into flame. The Zero became a meteor falling toward the sea, a bright orange streak against the blue water far below. 10 attacks. The combat report filed by the Wildcat pilot and corroborated by ground observers would eventually document 10 separate attack runs by Japanese fighters on his aircraft. 10 times, Zero pilots lined up their sights, squeezed their triggers, and expected to see the American fighter disintegrate or plunge earthward trailing fire. 10 times the Wildcat survived, turning, diving, climbing, using every trick that its pilot had learned and a few that he invented in the moment. The aircraft absorbed dozens of hits. Its tail section looked like it had been used for target practice. One aileron had a hole large enough to put a fist through. The port wing showed damage that ground crews would later photograph for technical reports, trying to understand the limits of what their machines could endure. But the engine ran, the controls responded, and the guns still had ammunition. What the Japanese pilots could not have understood, what their training and indoctrination had not prepared them for, was the fundamental difference in design philosophy that the Wildcat represented. Japanese aircraft were built for the war they expected to fight. A short, decisive conflict where superior maneuverability and pilot skill would overwhelm numerically inferior opponents. Weight was the enemy, so armor was minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks added pounds that reduced performance, so they were omitted. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrun most Allied fighters in 1942, but it achieved those capabilities by being, in essence, a flying razor blade, deadly in skilled hands but fragile when hit. The Wildcat embodied a different calculation. American designers assumed that their aircraft would take damage, that pilots would make mistakes, that combat would not always go according to plan. So they built fighters that could absorb punishment and bring their pilots home. They sacrificed some performance to gain survivability. They added weight in the form of armor plate behind the seat, around the engine, beneath the fuel tanks. They installed fuel tanks that would seal themselves when punctured, preventing fire even when enemy rounds found their mark. They made the airframe robust enough that it could sustain structural damage and remain controllable. These choices made the Wildcat slower than the Zero, made it less maneuverable in a turning fight, but they also made it infinitely harder to kill. On the 11th attack, something shifted in the dynamic of the engagement. By this point, the bomber formation had been scattered, some of its aircraft already turning north for the long flight back to Rabaul, others jettisoning their bombs into the ocean and running for home with Wildcats on their tails. The Japanese fighter pilots, who had begun the engagement with confidence born of past victories and superior aircraft specifications, now approached the lone American with something closer to caution. They had watched 2 of their squadron mates go down. They had poured hundreds of rounds into a single enemy fighter and watched it continue flying. This did not match what they had been told to expect. American pilots were supposed to be inferior. American aircraft were supposed to crumble under the discipline of Japanese gunnery. The 11th attack was less aggressive, more tentative. The Zero pilot made a high-side pass, firing a long burst from beyond optimal range, then breaking away before the Wildcat could respond. It was the action of a man who no longer fully believed in his invincibility, who had seen the gap between doctrine and reality and found it troubling. The rounds went wide. The Wildcat continued its steady flight, nursing damaged controls, conserving ammunition, waiting. The 12th attack came from a Japanese pilot who had either not witnessed the previous engagement or who possessed the kind of aggressive spirit that Japanese flight training cultivated above all else. He came in fast and committed, boring straight toward the Wildcat's 6 o'clock position with no fancy maneuvering, no attempt at deception. It was a gun run in its purest form, Point the nose at the target close to knife-fighting range and pull the trigger. At 200 yards, his 20mm cannons and machine guns opened up. At 150 yards, the American pilot could see the muzzle flashes from the Zero's wings. At 100 yards, with the Japanese fighter filling his rearview mirror and rounds hammering into his aircraft's empennage, the American pilot executed a maneuver that other pilots would discuss in the ready room for weeks afterward. He chopped his throttle to idle, simultaneously dropping his landing gear and extending his flaps. The effect was like throwing out an anchor at highway speed. The Wildcat's airspeed bled away so rapidly that the Zero pilot, committed to his high-speed run, found himself flying past his target rather than behind it. For a fraction of a second, the two aircraft were side by side, canopy to canopy, close enough that the pilots could have seen each other's faces if they had been looking. But the American pilot was not looking at his enemy. He was looking at his gun sight, which now framed the Zero perfectly. His thumb found the firing button on his control stick. 6.50 caliber machine guns, synchronized to pour their fire into a concentrated cone, unleashed a burst at point-blank range. The Zero never had a chance to recover. It pitched forward and went into the sea trailing debris, another circular ripple on the vast Pacific to mark where a man had died in service of his emperor. In the silence that followed, as the remaining Japanese aircraft turned north and fled for Rabaul, as the Wildcat limped back toward Henderson Field with its engine coughing and its hydraulics failing, ground personnel who had watched the engagement through binoculars stood in something approaching awe. They had witnessed what seemed impossible. A single American fighter, outnumbered and flying an aircraft that was supposedly obsolete, had not only survived but had claimed 3 confirmed kills. The combat report would be filed, the victory claims would be investigated and verified through multiple sources, and eventually the engagement would be cited in tactical manuals as an example of how proper tactics and robust engineering could overcome raw performance specifications. But the story of that morning over Guadalcanal represented something larger than a single engagement, larger than one pilot's skill or one aircraft's durability. It crystallized a truth that Japanese military leadership was beginning to reluctantly acknowledge. The war they were fighting was not the war they had planned for. They had prepared for a conflict where samurai spirit and tactical excellence would overcome material deficiencies. They had built their strategy around decisive battles and knockout blows. What they encountered instead was an enemy with a completely different approach to warfare. American industry had transformed itself with stunning speed after Pearl Harbor. Factories that had produced automobiles and refrigerators now churned out fighters, bombers, and tanks in quantities that Japanese planners had assumed were impossible. The United States had laid down so many aircraft carriers in 1942 and 1943 that they would soon outnumber the entire Japanese fleet by factors of 5 or 10 to 1. American pilots, who Japanese propaganda described as soft and undisciplined, were being trained in vast numbers, their instruction thorough if not lengthy, their aircraft reliable enough that they could focus on learning combat tactics rather than managing temperamental machines. An American doctrine embraced a brutal arithmetic. Aircraft were replaceable, but pilots were valuable. So build fighters that brought pilots home even when damaged. The Zero pilot who went into the sea that morning had been the product of years of intensive training. Japanese naval aviators were among the finest in the world in 1942. Men who had honed their skills in the skies over China, who could perform aerobatic maneuvers that seemed to violate the laws of physics. But each pilot lost was irreplaceable. Japan lacked the infrastructure to train replacements at the rate they were being lost. Each experienced aviator who died took with him years of institutional knowledge and combat wisdom that could not be quickly rebuilt. The Japanese Naval Air Force was consuming its seed corn, spending its most precious resource in battles of attrition that it could not win. The American pilot who landed his damaged Wildcat at Henderson Field that afternoon climbed out of his cockpit to find ground crew already swarming over the aircraft, counting holes, assessing damage, determining whether the fighter could be repaired or whether it would be cannibalized for parts to keep other aircraft flying. The pilot himself was shaking, not from fear, but from the delayed physical reaction to an hour of combat flying where every moment demanded total concentration, where a single lapse would have meant death. He would file his combat report in the standard format. Enemy aircraft encountered, actions taken, results observed. He would not philosophize about design philosophy or strategic implications. He was a young man who had been trained to do a job, and he had done it to the best of his ability with the tools he had been given. But those tools mattered. The Wildcat that sat on the Henderson Field tarmac that evening, ventilated and scarred but intact, was the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy. It had been designed by engineers in New York who had never seen combat but who understood that pilots were human beings who deserved every possible protection. It had been built by workers in factories across the United States, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time, each person responsible for riveting certain panels or installing specific systems, their collective effort producing a machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. It had been maintained by ground crews working in primitive conditions, using improvised tools, making repairs that the aircraft's designers had never anticipated but which the rugged construction made possible. Japanese observers, when they later studied American combat reports and tried to understand how their tactical advantages were being overcome, focused initially on pilot quality. Perhaps, they theorized, they had been mistaken about American aviators. Perhaps the enemy was more skilled than initial assessments suggested. This explanation was comforting because it located the problem in human factors rather than systematic ones. But deeper analysis revealed the uncomfortable truth. American success was not primarily about individual skill, though that certainly mattered. It was about an entire system designed to sustain long-term warfare. It was about aircraft that could absorb battle damage and return to fight again. It was about a replacement pilot pipeline that could make good losses faster than they accumulated. It was about maintenance procedures that kept aircraft operational in hostile environments. It was about a military culture that valued bringing pilots home as much as it valued destroying the enemy. The recurring symbol in this story, the thread that wove through the narrative of that December morning, was the aircraft itself. Not as a machine in the abstract, but as a representation of the society that built it. The Wildcat's armor plating was democracy's acknowledgement that individual lives mattered, that citizens sent to war were owed every protection that could be provided. Its self-sealing fuel tanks were the application of scientific method to save lives rather than simply maximize kill ratios. Its robust airframe was American industrial excess turned to purpose, the willingness to use more material to accept lower performance, to trade elegance for reliability. Every design choice reflected a value system that, however imperfectly realized in other domains, manifested clearly in how the nation equipped its warriors. The Japanese Zero, by contrast, was the product of a society that had industrialized rapidly but incompletely, that possessed pockets of technical excellence but lacked the deep industrial base to support total war. More significantly, it reflected a military culture that valued offensive spirit above all else, that saw protection and survivability as cowardice rendered in aluminum and steel. Japanese pilots flew into combat with virtually no armor because armor implied doubt, implied that the pilot might be hit, and such thinking was considered spiritually contaminating. The results were predictable. In the early months of the war, when Japanese pilots were veterans and American pilots were novices, the Zero's advantages in maneuverability carried the day. But as combat experience equalized and American tactics evolved to negate those advantages, the Zero's lack of protection became a fatal liability. By late 1942, American pilots had learned the cardinal rule. Never dogfight a Zero. Use your aircraft's strengths, diving speed, structural integrity, firepower, and avoid turning engagements where the Zero's lighter wing loading provided advantage. Attack from above, make one high-speed pass with guns blazing, then extend away using the Wildcat's superior diving speed. If you hit the Zero, its lack of protection meant that even a few rounds could cause catastrophic damage. If you missed, the robust Wildcat would shrug off return fire that would have been lethal to lighter aircraft. This tactical evolution transformed the combat calculus in the Pacific, turning what had been a superior Japanese fighter into a progressively less effective weapon as the war ground on. The engagement over Guadalcanal on that December morning became a case study precisely because it compressed so many of these themes into a single, intense experience. One American pilot in one Wildcat, facing overwhelming odds, survived through a combination of skill, tactics, and engineering. The Japanese pilots who attacked him were not incompetent. They were professionals executing the techniques they had been taught. But their techniques assumed an enemy that would crack under pressure, and instead they found an enemy that absorbed punishment and struck back. Their aircraft gave them advantages in speed and turning, but those advantages meant nothing if they could not translate hits into kills, and the Wildcat's construction made that translation difficult. Guadalcanal itself would drag on for months after this engagement, a grinding campaign where both sides fed men and material into a meat grinder that ran day and night. But the outcome was never truly in doubt after the first months. The United States could replace losses faster than they accumulated. Japan could not. Every irreplaceable veteran pilot lost over the Solomons was one fewer instructor to train the next generation. Every Zero shot down was one more demand on an industrial base that was already struggling to keep up with attrition rates. The arithmetic was brutal and inexorable. In the years after the war, historians and military analysts would parse these engagements, searching for lessons applicable to future conflicts. The technology would evolve: jet engines, missiles, radar-guided weapons, but certain principles remained constant. Nations that invested in protecting their personnel, that built systems for long-term attrition rather than short-term dominance, that valued sustainable excellence over dramatic superiority, these nations tended to prevail in extended conflicts. The Wildcat's survival that morning was not an anomaly or a stroke of luck. It was the predictable result of design choices made by engineers who understood that wars were won not in single glorious battles but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller engagements. The symbolic weight of that scarred Wildcat, sitting on Henderson Field as the sun set on December 7, 1942, extended beyond military hardware into the realm of ideology. The aircraft represented a particular vision of how democracies wage war. Reluctantly, but once committed, with overwhelming material advantage and a systematic approach that ground down opponents through sheer resource depth. This was not the romanticized vision of warfare that Japanese military culture celebrated, with its emphasis on spirit and sacrifice. It was instead a pragmatic, almost industrial approach that treated war as a problem to be solved through logistics, engineering, and sustained effort. Japanese military leadership had fundamentally misunderstood this aspect of American character. They had observed American isolationism in the 1930s and concluded that the United States lacked the will to fight a determined opponent. They had noted American luxury and material abundance and assumed it produced soft soldiers. What they failed to grasp was that American industrial capacity, once mobilized, could produce material abundance in the context of warfare just as it had in peacetime. The same factories that made Americans the most automobile-rich society on Earth could pivot to making them the most aircraft-rich military on Earth. The same engineering culture that had created assembly lines for consumer goods could create assembly lines for fighters and bombers. As night fell over Guadalcanal, the day's combat reports began their journey up the chain of command, eventually reaching staff officers who would collate multiple such reports into intelligence assessments about enemy tactics and capabilities. The story of the Wildcat that survived 12 attacks would be noted, filed, and studied. Training curricula would be adjusted. Tactical doctrines would be refined. Future pilots would learn from this engagement, and some of them would survive their own desperate encounters because of lessons extracted from this one. The Japanese pilot who went down with his Zero that morning left behind no such legacy. His death would be noted in official records, his family would be notified through formal channels, and eventually his name would be inscribed at Yasukuni Shrine among the war dead. But the tactical lesson his death should have taught, that Japanese aircraft needed better protection, that offensive spirit alone could not overcome material disadvantage. This lesson was either not learned or not acted upon. Japan continued building Zeros with minimal armor and unprotected fuel tanks because retooling production would have required resources that the empire did not possess. They were locked into a design philosophy that had been optimized for a short war, and they were now fighting a long one. In the vast historiography of World War II, individual aerial engagements rarely merit extended attention. The Pacific Theater alone saw thousands of such encounters, each one involving men who believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves, each one potentially decisive for the individuals involved even if statistically insignificant in the broader conflict. Yet this particular engagement over Guadalcanal contained within it the essential narrative of the Pacific War in microcosm. Japanese tactical excellence and aircraft performance meeting American material abundance and systematic thinking, with the outcome determined not by a single factor but by the accumulated weight of many small advantages that compounded over time. The Wildcat itself would eventually be superseded by better aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, which began reaching fleet squadrons in 1943, was faster, more maneuverable, and even better protected than its predecessor. American aircraft design continued to evolve, incorporating lessons learned in combat, benefiting from technological advances, and always maintaining that core focus on survivability. The Japanese would continue to produce variants of the Zero throughout the war, making incremental improvements but never fundamentally addressing its vulnerability to battle damage. By 1945, experienced Japanese pilots were scarce enough that the Empire resorted to training young men for single-flight suicide missions, a final desperation that revealed how completely the attrition strategy had devastated Japan's air forces. But on that December morning in 1942, as the damaged Wildcat taxied to its revetment and its pilot climbed out to solid ground, the end of the war was still years away and far from certain. What was certain was that a young American pilot had faced combat against superior numbers, had been given an aircraft that protected him when he was hit, and had been trained in tactics that allowed him to fight effectively even when disadvantaged. He had survived because his nation had made choices about what mattered. Not the most elegant fighter or the fastest aircraft, but the one that brought pilots home and could be produced in quantities that made individual losses sustainable. This was the arithmetic of democracy at war, unglamorous, methodical, and ultimately unstoppable. The Japanese military had gambled that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage, that a short, decisive war would spare them from the grinding attrition where America's industrial superiority would tell. They lost that gamble, and the proof lay scattered across the Pacific in sunken ships, in crashed aircraft, and in the combat reports of pilots who flew inferior aircraft by the numbers but superior aircraft by design philosophy. The Wildcat that survived 12 attacks was eventually repaired and returned to service. It would fly more combat missions over Guadalcanal and later other contested islands as the American advance moved north. Eventually it would be rotated back to training duties, where it would teach a new generation of pilots the feel of combat maneuvering, the discipline of gunnery, the procedures that kept men alive. When the war ended, it would be surplus property, likely sold for scrap or abandoned at some remote airfield to slowly corrode in tropical weather. But its story, captured in combat reports and pilot debriefings, would persist. It would become one of hundreds of small narratives that collectively told the larger story of how democracies, slow to anger but comprehensive in response, wage and win wars of survival. The sun set that evening over Henderson Field in the same spectacular fashion it always did in the South Pacific, painting the sky in oranges and purples that briefly made men forget they were in a combat zone. The damaged Wildcat sat in its revetment, ground crew working under portable lights to patch holes and replace damaged components. Somewhere to the north, at Rabaul, Japanese officers were receiving reports of the day's mission. Bombers scattered, 3 fighters lost, minimal damage inflicted on American positions. The mathematics of attrition continued their inexorable calculation, each such mission eroding Japanese capabilities by fractions that would eventually sum to collapse. This was the deeper truth that the Wildcat's survival illuminated, that warfare between industrial nations in the 20th century was decided less by individual heroism or tactical brilliance than by systematic advantages compounded over time. The American pilot who survived that morning was brave and skilled, but he was also protected by engineers who had never fired a gun in combat, supplied by logistics personnel who would never see the front lines, and supported by an industrial base that stretched across an entire continent. His victory was individual in execution but collective in origin. The Japanese pilots he faced were equally brave, possibly more skilled given their longer training, and they flew aircraft that were in many ways superior to his own. But they were operating at the end of a long logistical chain that was being strangled by American submarines, supported by an industrial base that could not replace losses, and trained in a tactical philosophy that had not adapted to changing circumstances. Their defeat was individual in manifestation but systematic in cause. And so the war continued, one engagement at a time, one damaged Wildcat limping home, 1-0 falling into the sea, each small action part of a larger mosaic that would eventually reveal its pattern. The pattern was clear to those who looked beyond individual battles. Abundance would overcome scarcity, systematic planning would overcome tactical brilliance, and societies that protected their warriors would outlast those that spent them freely. The Wildcat that survived 12 attacks was not just one aircraft story. It was the story of democracy's approach to existential conflict, rendered in aluminum and steel, written in tracer rounds and combat reports, and preserved in the memory of men who understood that they had been part of something larger than themselves, something that transcended the immediate terror and chaos of combat to touch upon fundamental questions about how nations organize themselves for survival. In the end, that was what the Japanese pilots could not believe. Not that one Wildcat survived, but what that survival represented. They had been taught that their way was superior, that spirit trumped steel, that cultural factors determined outcomes. The reality was more prosaic and more devastating. Industrial capacity determined outcomes. Systematic thinking determined outcomes. Design philosophy determined outcomes. And on all these measures, the United States possessed advantages that would eventually prove insurmountable. The young Japanese pilot who died that morning could not have understood this. He had been too thoroughly indoctrinated in his nation's mythology. But in the moment before his Zero hit the water, perhaps he had an instant of clarity, a final recognition that he was fighting not just an enemy pilot but an entire system that had outthought, outbuilt, and outplanned his own. That recognition, multiplied across thousands of similar engagements, was the Pacific War in essence, a collision between two visions of modern warfare, with the ultimate victor determined not by courage or skill but by which vision more accurately reflected the realities of industrial age conflict.